Welcome to the Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Back in 1979, Dave began a radio career at CHEZ 106 in Ottawa, which spanned 17 years. He was one of the on-air voices that I grew up listening to, and he introduced me to new music that literally changed my life. His knowledge and passion for music are inspiring, to say the least. And in this 6-part podcast, Dave and I sit down and discuss the British invasion. So I'm sitting here with the man, the myth, and the legend, Dave Kittle.
What a build-up.
It is a build-up. And I say that when I say legend, what I mean by that is, and I've said this to you before, that you were a huge part of my late teen years and early adult years, because you were on CHEZ 106. I listened to you all the time. And you and a few of the other voices, but you in particular, you introduced me to music that would forever change my life, because it just did. And you guys, when I seem to recall, correct me if I'm wrong, but back in those days, when were you on CHEZ?
I actually worked there 3 different times.
Okay.
I started there in 1979. My first job in radio was in Montreal at CHOM FM.
Right.
Right out of halfway through my broadcasting career, or my education, I went to Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, to radio broadcasting, and halfway through my second year, I got a job in Montreal doing the all-night show at CHOM FM.
Okay.
Which was a pretty big deal. CHOM FM at the time
was huge.
It was a big station. CHOM FM in Toronto and CHOM FM in Montreal were probably the 2 only progressive rock stations in the country, 2 of a few. CHEZ was on the air at the time, but it was in its infancy. It started in 77. I think it went on the air in the spring of 77.
Okay.
And I started in Montreal in 78.
Okay.
The winter of February of 78. My dates are a little bit wrong. Anyway, I worked at CHEZ 3 different times. I started there in 1979, and then I left to go to another station. Came back in the mid-'80s and worked there for another 7 or 8 years. Got let go.
Okay.
In a money crunch, and then came back again. So I worked there 17 years all in all. Wow. So pretty well right through the 1980s.
Yeah.
And into the 90s.
Okay.
Now, the nice thing about CHEZ at the time was there was no other competition in the city. It was it. So if you were a fan of popular music in the day, the only outlet really was CFRA, and they only played pop music at night.
That's right.
CFGO, which was like an old-style top 40 station.
Yeah. And
CHEZ, which was a / progressive rock radio station.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would play album tracks on FM.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about that was we had no competition, so we could play anything we wanted. Now, the jocks didn't have total freedom.
Okay.
But compared to a lot of other radio stations at the time, the jocks had a lot of choice as to what they could play.
Yeah.
Within the parameters of what was kind of accepted. Like, you couldn't bring in any album from your collection and just throw it on. There were certain albums that our library was quite large, but you could pick and choose different tracks and make your own kind of playlists.
See, that's so cool, because that's not done today.
Oh God, no! It hasn't been done for years. It hasn't been done for years.
And I seem to recall that the music you guys were introducing was new. Like, I remember when the album I, Robot came out from Alan Parsons. And I don't know if it was you, maybe it wasn't you, but I remember you talking about it, because you have this voice, Dave. It's a voice, it's soothing, and it makes you sound like you really know what you're talking about. I think you do. I believe that you do know what you're talking about, but it comes through in your voice, probably because you have a passion for music.
Oh, I appreciate that, which I do. I have since I was 12.
Yeah.
With the first time my parents bought me a record player for my birthday and a stack of 45s, and I've been a fan of music ever since. Now, I grew up. I was 11 years old when the Beatles hit. I know rock and roll started before the Beatles hit, but I kind of that to me is the defining moment for people of my generation. I'm in my mid-60s now, so the people of my generation, when the Beatles hit North America, that's kind of was day one.
Yeah.
I knew nothing really before that. I didn't know who Jerry Lee Lewis or Little Richard or Chuck Berry or any of these people were. But when the Beatles hit, that's when I got interested in popular music.
Right.
And I was 11 in February of '64.
Do you know how old I was?
When
I would be just over a year old.
really?
Yeah. I was born in August of 1963.
63,
And the Beatles are a huge part of my life too.
Well,
Because their music's,
and you're right. You didn't have to have been exposed to them when they first hit to appreciate how good they were.
Yeah.
But I was 11 when they played. I was a week before my 12th birthday. They played the Ed Sullivan Show, February '64. So that's when I became interested in popular music, and that's when I started listening to it. And in the last little while, I don't know. I've always been I've always been interested in the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah.
So like most people of my generation, they grew up listening to albums. That grew up with vinyl.
Yeah.
I read album covers voraciously. I would sit in my room, listening to the albums, reading the album covers, which almost all of them in those days listed album credits, who played on them, who produced them, etc., 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 whether it was recorded. Some were in more detail than others, but I read all of that, and I remembered it all. And I've always been really interested in the story behind the songs.
Yeah.
Who wrote it, where it was recorded, who played on it, who the engineers were, who the producer was, what studio was it recorded in, who designed the album cover, all kinds of stuff. I find that fascinating. And in the last, 10 years or so, I've really developed quite an interest in it. And ever since the invention of the internet and Wikipedia especially, and the amount of information that you can get online now, I love that kind of stuff. I soak that up. So I find that, and I've since gone back pre-February '64, and rediscovered a lot of the pioneers, I call them, of rock and roll. The Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Everly Brothers, all these people, James Brown, all these people that paved the way for the era of music that really I started becoming interested in. And I say February '64, Beatles, Stones, Byrds, all that British invasion stuff, and the American stuff that followed very quickly in its wake. That's when I really got interested in it.
So when the British invasion started, you were, or I guess you would say that started pretty much with the Beatles, right? I mean, they made
they
big impact.
They opened the door. They kicked the door open.
So you're 11 years old.
I'm 12. I'm a week before my 12th birthday when they played the Ed Sullivan Show, which is.
Well, your memories, like what do you recall thinking? What was like a thought in your head when you heard this music for the first time? Was it hyped? Like, were people saying anything, or suddenly they just played the song and that was it?
I vaguely remember, Norm, hearing about the Beatles before they played the Ed Sullivan Show, but I'd never heard any of their music.
Okay.
I'd never seen a picture of them. I didn't really know who they were. I'd heard of them. But back in 1964, what happened in Europe, it wasn't reported over here.
Okay.
It was they were huge. Don't forget, in 1963, the year they broke in Britain, they were massive in Britain. They were the biggest thing since sliced bread in England. But we didn't know who they were over here. Nobody knew who they were. Yeah. And so when they played the Ed Sullivan Show, it was more of a curiosity than anything else. And I remember, I still remember this like it was yesterday, in my parents' living room in Cornwall, watching their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show with my mother and father, brother and sister, who were 14 and 15 years older than me.
15 years older than you.
Yeah, so they were my brother would have been 2 years older than John Lennon. He was born in 1938. John Lennon was born in 1940. So when the Beatles played the Ed Sullivan Show, John Lennon was 23 years old. Right. My brother was 25. So they were the same age. But of a completely different world. My brother and my sister, who were 14 and 15 years older than me, were not into them at all.
Wow.
Even though they were approximately the same age.
Right.
And never were. Never got into rock and roll at all. My sister was a big Harry Belafonte fan.
Interesting.
She loved Harry Belafonte, who was a big star back in those days. Big star back in the.
But they didn't get the bug.
They did not get into the rock and roll bug, even though they were approximately the same age as the Beatles were.
You've been listening to The Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Join us again next week for the continuation of this podcast, brought to you by Sunholes Music. Download the latest album now at sunholes.com.